author. His works include poetry, essays, plays, and short stories. Mr. Agüeros has written television dramas which have been aired on public television and WNBC TV, and has written essays which appeared in Thomas C. Wheeler's anthology, The Immigrant Experience. Jack Agüeros' first book of poetry, Correspondence Between the Stone Howlers, was published in 1991. In this work, his sonnets and songs give voice to those who struggle against poverty, racism, and greed. Mr. Agüeros' debut collection of short stories is entitled Dominoes and Other Stories from the Puerto Rican. Together, they convey the complex reality of the Puerto Rican experience. Mr. Agüeros has received numerous awards for his literary works. Amongst his many accomplishments, Jack Agüeros was the director of El Museo del Barrio, the sole Puerto Rican culture institution in New York. A New York City Commissioner of the Community Development Agency, founder and curator of the first Puerto Rican Latin American art gallery in New York, and the executive director of Mobilization for Youth. Tonight, Mr. Agüeros will be reading from his latest collection entitled Dominoes and Other Stories. In this collection, Jack Agüeros brings the reality of Puerto Rican experience in New York fully to life. In stories that span the decades of the 1940s through 1990s, he recreates the barrio with its candy stores, plaster saints, numbers collectors, tropical fruit vendors, and sidewalk games of domino. Its knife fights and junkies rap and successful stories of craftsmen and entrepreneurs. These stories, though bittersweet, affirm our common humanity. Lastly, allow me to quote from Robert Cole's review of Dominoes and Other Stories as a wonderful collection of stories full of the particulars of a people's encounter with America, told with persuasive grace, charm, and honesty. And now please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack Agüeros.
Good evening. I hope I can live up to all that introduction. I've been reading stories from Dominoes and Stories. And I'm going to start with a story that takes place as a conversation between two men who have known each other from childhood. And one of them is a drug addict at the moment the story begins and ends. And the other is sort of thinking about what he's going to do with his life. And they're talking about a third person that they also knew, though possibly not at the same time, in their youth. And that's why the story is called Oscar's Story. For those of you who are under 13 years of age, I recommend that you leave and come back with your parents, because there is some strong language here, which I did not invent, but I do use it in the story. It's the Oscar Story. Carlos and Sal have been drinking together off and on, especially on weekends, for most of the summer. Carlos was a junkie, Sal knew well. From childhood, from before he had become a junkie. And he was the only junkie Sal knew who liked both beer and wine. But like other junkies, Carlos despised rum and whiskey. If you just mentioned rum or whiskey, Carlos would make a face, and then start doing something with his throat and mouth that seemed like he was having dry heaves. He had that kind of sense of humor. The kind of humor everybody had when they were all boys in junior high school together. One especially hot night when beer or wine got hot before you were even halfway through the can or bottle, Carlos looked up after a long period of staring into one blank space. Maybe it had been a reverie. It came after he had stopped nodding, that amazing balancing act that junkies do after they shoot heroin. They sway to one side, you swear they will fall, and tilted at some exaggerated angle, they suddenly pop upright. Open their eyes a tiny bit, only momentarily, and start tilting again on another angle. Swaying but not falling. You never saw one fall. You saw junkies all over Spanish Harlem, nodding, Sometimes they would scratch some part of their body, usually the face, arms, or legs, lightly, in slow motion. Sometimes they scratched so hard you could see ulcerated skin suppurating and dried cicatrices on their arms or legs, around the wrists or ankles. You also saw two guys dragging a third guy between them, keeping the third guy walking to prevent his slipping into a coma or stupor, which was a way station not far from death, and therefore had to be avoided. Sal never understood the whole sequence. Considering how many junkies he knew and how many he had seen, he had never spent one whole day with a junkie. Sal didn't know what came first, a certain semi-consciousness, followed by nodding and scratching, or the scratching first, then the other. He also never knew if the junkies weren't experimenting with whatever was cheap and available, catch of the day, and mixing heroin with amphetamines. The goofballs made them talk, talk, talk. The grass made them laugh. The heroin made them nod. And in combination, or washed down with beer or wine, what did that make them do? Maybe the scratching came as a sign that it was time for another dose. Carlos stared at Sal and then said, "My father used to say that thinking and reading too much was bad for the brain, you know? But I have met a lot of guys who thought a lot, and a lot of guys who never thought about nothing, and their brains were the same." Did I ever tell you Oscar's story? I had a cousin named Oscar who played the drums and went to the Bronx High School of Science, see? He was definitely the smartest guy in the whole family, but he wigged out. He went completely crazy. You know the Bronx High School of Science is one of the best high schools in the United States, right, Sal? His father, who was my uncle and owned the candy store that used to be over there, but Carlos pointed to the southwest corner of Lexington Avenue and 110th Street. It had the best malted milks in the whole neighborhood, except for the ice cream parlor on 18th Street and 3rd Avenue. But you couldn't go up to 118th every day because of the Italians, and especially the Italian gang called the Red Wings. My uncle used to put out that his son went crazy because he was so intelligent and he studied so hard. You know, you got to take a very tough test to get into Bronx Science. You know that, right, Sal? But that was a whole lot of bullshit on my uncle's part. Oscar went crazy because his father, my uncle, Manolo, was a fucking tightwad. Hard as my elbow. Carlos made a fist with his right hand and knocked on his left elbow for emphasis. Tacaño, he said. Then in case Sal hadn't understood, he used another Spanish word. Maceta. Hard, cheap, chintzy. Sal wondered what chintzy had to do with chintz. Maybe chintz was a cheap cloth or fabric. Man, that cat was making big effing bucks from that candy store. He had the best collection of funny books. And I still remember the very clean tile floor. Had a very pretty pattern in the center. Dark tiles and light tiles, a border of black tiles, and a few red tiles forming a diamond here and there. And the tables was round pieces of marble, and the chairs was made out of bent wire. You remember, with wooden seats? They was like the side chairs in the barber shop too, and the same chairs they had on 118. The joint always smelled great. It smelled a little like tobacco, a little like malt, a little like funny book paper. But Manolo wouldn't give his son a dime, not one thin, tiny dime. When Oscar got a girlfriend and the old man told Oscar to bring her to the candy store and he would sell her a soda or malted at a discount. Can you imagine that shit, a discount for his son's girlfriend? Then when the girl got to the store, Manolo gave her the 3rd degree. Then it was an interrogation. Oscar wanted to die from embarrassment. His girl wanted to run and never see any of them again, but she was a sweet Puerto Rican girl. And she just sat answering Manolo's questions politely, never looking him in the eye. What does your father do? Does he work? Where? Does your mother work? Is she religious? But even after that, Manolo decided that his son was not studying enough and not practicing the drums enough, and he started saying that Oscar was sinful to go out with girls. That he ought to spend his full time studying and drumming. It was too much, man. One day I went in the candy store after school, and there was Oscar taking care of the counter, doing drumming drills on his practice pad. You ever see one of them things? It's a rubber thing, a hunk of rubber on a piece of wood, see, and then drumstick, bang, bang on the rubber, and they bounce back like off drumsticks, but you ain't got the noise of drums. My uncle, his father, was counting his money, or some shit in the back. I know he wasn't stacking bottles, because he had slave Oscar for all the real work. I said to Oscar, man, what are you doing, 2 things at once? Oscar said, yeah, my father thinks I should practice when there are no customers. Then one day, Manolo pulled the final drag. My uncle became a Pentecostal. Hallelujah. Oh man, I had to stop going to the candy store. The cat wouldn't stop talking El Señor. Talking God, talking Jesus, the man. Every time he went into the store, he put the conversation into God. You say, how are you? He would say, thanks to God, I'm okay. God is the source of our health. And he would go into a preaching in a minute. Then he started having these preachers come in to break Oscar down. Telling Oscar he was sinful because he went out with girls. And then he was sinful because he didn't obey his father. And then he was sinful because he didn't practice enough and didn't study enough. He didn't want to turn his soul over to God, give his life to Jesus, or play drums in the temple. See, they never say church, they always say temple. What I figured out from listening to Oscar was that these preacher cats had never seen no real sins. So they thought all this bullshit was sins. I stopped going in the store. My cousin Oscar had become a maniac. He had a look in his eyes like Boris Karloff. Only Oscar wasn't acting. No matter how much I missed those malteds, or the egg creams, or the 4-cent sodas. Actually, Pop's candy store on the other corner of Lexington made better egg creams, and also Pop, who wasn't the cheapskate, put more flavor in the 4-cent sodas. When Pop made you a lime soda or a cherry lime Ricky, he let you see him putting the flavor in the seltzer. And his sodas was rich in taste. They had strong color. My Uncle Manolo, he never let you see what he was doing behind the counter. And one of his 4-cent sodas looked like Dracula got to it first and drank off the best part. Things looked anemic. If I went in the store, Manolo was there, I would only buy a phony book. Then I would wait for my cousin to be taking care of the store to get my malteds. But even missing those malteds like I did, you know, I think I had an addiction to them. It was too painful to go in the store. On this side, you got Preacher Papa non-stop. On this side, you got Oscar drumming. His eyes looking wilder and wilder, speaking less and less. Carlos stopped talking. Sal drank wine. And he wondered what would happen next. Would Carlos continue the story? Or would he start another story? Forget that he had been telling a story? Or would the next part contradict everything that he said before? You never knew, because you never knew what was talking, Carlos or the heroine, or Carlos and the heroine. Was it all made up? Was only part made up? Sal remembered the candy store, remembered the kid drumming on the pad. The summer came and went, and Oscar was drumming all day and into the night. Then what had to happen, happened. He wigged out. Oscar had been in the back, busy, bringing bottles from the basement into basement 1, when he noticed that someone was calling him. That's when Manolo, his father, my uncle, that's his name, Manolo. When Manolo started yelling, hey Oscar, what's taking you so long? Are you drinking my sodas? Now see, I happen to know that Oscar never drank sodas, never drank malteds. Oscar hated them, man, you know? The cigarettes was different. He'd cup a Lucy once in a while, but he hated the sweet drinks. Oscar came out with a case of soda in his hand and put it down in the middle of the floor. Then he went over to his practice pad and he took the drumsticks in his hands, but he didn't play. He just sat over the practice pad. You ever seen a cat with his temper hanging over his water with a faraway look? That's how Oscar was sitting. Manolo said, Jesus, sweet love. What's wrong, Oscar? Why aren't you practicing? Put that soda box where it belongs. And Oscar got up from the counter. And he started to gently drum on his father's head. Manolo started saying, "Look, look," and started to back away. Manolo grabbed the broom and hit Oscar. And Oscar took the soda crate, one of them old ones that have wooden steel, and he bashed his father over the head with it. And when his father was on the floor, bleeding from a gash in his bald skull, Oscar started drumming on his head. Oscar's mother came in the store later, much later, late enough for the blood to be black and sticky on Manolo's head, black and sticky on the drumsticks. But Oscar was sitting right there next to his passed out father, drumming on his head. And when Oscar saw her, he threw a bottle at her, hit his mother right on the shoulder. She called the cops. I remember that kid, but I don't think I knew his name was Oscar. Said Sal, paper wine cup in his hands. I remember that kid sitting there drumming. I used to think of him as a lucky kid. All the funny books, ice cream, sodas, everything the kid could want, right? Wrong, said Carlos. Wrong as shit. That kid Oscar never got the right time of day from his old man. I know, he was my cousin. I was better off than him, and I had nothing, not even a father. You know, Carlos, I heard about the kid wigging out, but the story I got was that the kid had wigged out drumming and that a Pentecostal guy had cured the kid. Cured the kid by bringing him Jesus, and that then the old man and the old lady converted when they saw the miracle. Yeah, that's the story Manolo put out, but it wasn't like that. Take it from me, I swear to God, I swear to my mother. Carlos made the sign of the cross over himself. Then he put his right thumb over his right index finger's first joint, making a little cross, which he then kissed, mentioning the Holy Ghost. I'm in the family. My mother still gets mail from my Uncle Manolo. Manolo stood with a paralyzed face after that, either from the blood he lost or the blow. You could see that he couldn't smile right on one side of his face, you know? And Oscar went to a funny farm after they found him criminally insane. Can you beat that shit? It was his father who was criminally insane. But anyway, Oscar went upstate and he was doing good. He was like a trustee, you know? He worked with the gardeners, cutting grass, trimming hedges, like that. And he never was interested in music. But every time his father or mother went to visit him, he would get all worked up again. But finally, they put a prohibition on the folks from visiting. So they checked out to Puerto Rico. That's a fucked up story, isn't it? Ask Sal. No, man, that ain't a fucked up story. It's just a story. Yeah. And where is that kid now? I mean, Oscar, he's no kid anymore. Do you know? Oscar? Oscar, my cousin? He's still here. On our corner. Because we are talking about him. He is alive with us. Give me some more wine. Sal filled 2 more cups with the sweet, sneaky Pete. No longer cold. Yeah, I swear to my mother, said Carlos. Then he drank, as if it were a toast. He's here on our corner. Then he crossed his right thumb over the first joint of his right index finger and kissed it. And he said, may my mother drop dead if Oscar's not here on this corner with us. Thank you. Somebody stole my red wine while I was reading. And have left me 3 glasses of water instead. Am I supposed to share these with you, Martin? Drink one now and save you one? What? You can drink 2.5. I don't. You know what I don't like is I get very parched reading, and you start feeling very uncomfortable. So I wonder, well, why don't I drink some water? Well, it's very relieving. Because when you're nervous, as I am, and you grab a glass of water, your hand begins to shake like this and the water spills all over the place. It's very embarrassing. So I'm going to turn my back and take a swig out of my whiskey bottle, and you will forgive me, all right? Yeah, I'm not even. reason I forgot the whiskey bottle tonight. I'm going to read a little bit from another story. How's my time, by the way? I failed to see what time it's. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from another story. Oscar's story is a story about two men who are actually, in my mind anyway, they're talking about stories, you know? So to me it's like a meditation on stories and how people tell stories and how they react to each other's stories. This is a story which is called agua viva, which is Spanish for a kind of jellyfish, sometimes called the Portuguese man of war, but not always. Sometimes they're confused with another species. And the story is called Agua Viva, a sculpture by Alfredo Gonzalez. And it's a story about a man who's crazy, has been crazy for at least 5 years. But in a moment of his insanity, he conceives of a work of art. And in that conception, begins to recover his sanity. At least that's what I think happened to him. So I'm going to read a little bit more. The knuckles ached, as did the hands of the man who had been dragging chain and handling heavy iron pieces for years. His greasy hands, hair follicles and pores, supersaturated with oils, grime, and ferrous particles caught and caked in them, no longer felt the long, sharp, and shallow cuts, or the multiple punctures that scalpeled edges on cams and cogs of highly polished steel and burrs on poorly finished cast iron inflict on human skin. He had never liked work gloves. He had not washed his hands for 5 years. He tugged at the tangle of chains, of pulleys, of polished parts, of alternately painted and rusty parts that lay scrambled on the concrete driveway next to his house and midway between the street and his garage. He was pulling the mass toward the garage when it occurred to him that it would make a very beautiful sculpture. He would have to affix one end to the top of an A-frame, arrange the chains like runners in Virginia creeper, and then tie weights at the bottom of each of the chains so that they would hang taut. He could call it agua viva because it would remind him of the jellyfish that inhabit the waters off Puerto Rico. There was a good A-frame in the shed, too good in fact. He would have to cover part of the frame under plastic while he hosed the A-frame down to induce some rust. And he would probably have to distress the A-frame with the peen side of one of his hammers to chip away the industrially baked on enamel paint. You had to transform the A-frame to make the whole piece harmonious. Otherwise, it would be two separate elements, one of pretty painted parts and one of junk. The A-frame had to be distressed, yes. Distress can turn the dull to beauty. Iron and steel do not tangle like thread, cord, or rope. Perhaps chain tangles like logs, and words like jam or snag would be better to describe what happens when links twist out of line and chains of different gauge twine like tresses. Wood has water, or better said, logs have water to propel them part of their weight. Professional handlers have winches and pulleys and special vehicles to transport piles like the one the man now dragged up the slightly inclining driveway. Something hit his face, and he realized that something had hit his body twice before. He looked up to see 3 boys throwing things at him that he could not immediately identify. Nor could he recognize the voice. Were they his son's friends? Where was his son? Filthy Fredo, yeah, 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 yeah. They shouted. Were they talking to him? Who was Filthy Fredo? He dropped the massive chains and took up one of the thrown things. It was a clod of soil with tufts of grass and grass roots holding it together. Dirt for the dirty, filth for filthy Fredo, chanted the boys nearby. In his hand, the sod felt like a pearl compared to the usual objects he handled. He threw it and hit one of the boys squarely on the face, striking both the nose and lips. The boy, perhaps 11, started to cry and bleed at the same time. None ran. The man started forward, and the boy, perhaps 14 years old, decided to run. But the man caught him and clamped one hand on the boy's shoulder at the same time he brought his other hand open across the boy's head. With a dull whoop, the boy twirled, and the man then shove-kicked the boy down the driveway. The third boy, the youngest one of all, was long ago gone. From across the street, a man hollered, "Good for you, Gonzalez! Welcome back to Earth!" What the man across the street knew, and the boys had known, was that the man they all called Filthy Fredo had never retaliated, had never even changed the taunting teenagers, the yah-yah-yahing younger boys. No wonder they were caught off guard. In fact, before this moment, he had never reacted at all. Not for 5 and maybe 7 years. To anything. Except iron and steel. Wheels and manhole covers. And grates and wrenches and gaggers and rods and gears and discs and platings and gates and chucks and clutches and drills and spools and bobbins. Locks and keys, pinions and racks and gaffles and meat hooks and ball joints and shuttles and flycocks. And gaffers and dividers and rasps and gyroscopes, graters and gimbals, grab hooks. 1,000 parts, too small or too complex or too divorced from their origin or context or too specialized, and thus identifiable only by their creator, cluttered the length and breadth of the walls of his house, of the walls of his garage, of the walls of his shed, and finally, having displaced length and breadth, the pieces also piled and accumulated in corners and centers, so that finally, they even displaced the girth, the very girth of his abode. His house had become the lair of the iron woodchuck, the hive of the iron bee, the storeroom of the iron squirrel, the complex of chambers of the iron ant. From wall to wall, from floor to ceiling, the mountain of metal was broken only by a thin corridor that was wide enough for the passage of one man at a time, and which changed direction as often as a young river in the mountain. In the beginning, not in the very beginning of his life when he was named Alfredo, after months and months of arguing between his mother and father. In that beginning, he had been the first son, and his parents had spent a considerable amount of their waking hours, perhaps their sleeping hours also, in consideration of an appropriate name. By the 7th child, selecting names was less of a problem. In the beginning, Alfredo had been agreed to after 8 1/2 months of arguing, and just 14 hours before he was born. As soon as he was brought home, his father looked at him, all swaddled against the winter, and he said, if we were still in Puerto Rico, he would not wear so much clothing. And ugly, I would find him bigger. Now he looks so small, I can't call him Alfredo. I think I'll call him Fredo. The boys were cruel and called him Filthy Fredo, thus facing a creature they only partly recognized and did not understand. The scientists created chains of noyes and phrenes and complicated sprockets and interlocking phrases to describe Fredo. In the end, after a year, they released him as traumatized but harmless. And on the cover of the file folder that contained his dossier, there was a number, a date, and the simple phrase, "Return to community." There was no name on the face of the folder, but perhaps the letters G-O-N were an abbreviation for Gonzalez, rather than an abbreviation for gone. In the beginning of the iron collecting, he had brought the pieces home after much thinking, hesitation, selection, and bartering. Then he would spend hours removing paint or rust, applying navel jelly or a torch and wire brush, depending on the need. And he would hang the pieces, leaving air around each piece so that it could breathe and be seen both in the beauty of its form, composition, and harmony, its exquisite proportions, or in its indivisible simplicity, in its own beauty, and in relation to the other members of the displayed collection. And he kept notebooks assigning a number, noting measurements, weights, a description of the object, what metal it was, its uses or purposes if he knew it, and its provenance if he knew that. A price and date would be entered if it was a purchase and had been found or given to him, the place found, or the name of the giver. Finally, if any appeared, the maker's mark, and if known, who that mark belonged to. There generally was a drawing or a photograph as well. Thus, in the beginning, the interest in collecting had been a pleasure, and a hobby, and even a science. Sometimes the avid amateur can be more thorough than the museum professional. And the iron had occupied a portion of his life space, his time, his psyche, his physical space. Now, it was iron and steel, wall to wall. One of a kind became next to scrap. Art under decoration, under function, under technology, under dross, all in an incubator. No, a compost. And parallel to this total displacement of his physical space, iron had totally replaced his time, or blocked or separated him from that time. As if time and its rigid tick-tock trajectory were thwarted by the crumpled metallic maze. Or perhaps the magnetic mass was so great it created a false true north for time. Or perhaps time, entering the irrational dimension of this prodigious pile, was bent the way sun rays refract through angled glass, and then could not escape the greenhouse. Alfredo Gonzalez, mostly known as Fredo, also known as Filthy Fredo, entered his house and was shocked at the disorder. It was as if he had entered a tight stacked section of a library with a minimum walk space between the stacks. But there were neither books nor shelves, just piles of metal objects. From clockworks to the flywheel of a tractor, to the cap piece of a massive boiler. There was barely a path among the piles of objects. He switched on a lamp that was made from a cast iron newel post that he had assembled in 1959. But it would not light. Neither would any others when he could reach around the mountains of objects to try switches. Had it not been for the newel post, he would not have believed he was in his own home. He worked his way to the telephone, which, buried under dirt and grease, did not work. Neither was there water or gas in the kitchen, and the windows were opaque. The meager gray light that filtered through was further defeated by the piles and piles of objects on the available counter space, and leaning in rows against the cabinets on the floors. He could not locate the refrigerator. He remembered that his hallway bathroom had 2 windows, but even there the light was insufficient to illuminate his image in the mirror. He opened one half of one window with a small pry bar that lay behind the commode, and he turned and gazed in the mirror, and what he saw there stopped his heart. In the mirror was the head and shoulders of a man who had not bathed, shaven, or shorn his hair for 5 or more years, and who had not seen himself in that time either. He reacted by looking at his hands, one of which still held a pry bar. In disbelief, he raised his hands and looked again in the mirror. The hands matched, and then there was an explosion. The hand holding the pry bar had come down on the mirror, creating everything from glass dust to splinters to large chunks which still held the bizarre face. Fredo gasped, and his breath came short and with difficulty as if he had been running. His head whirled with fear, with incomprehension, with loathing, and disorientation, with dread. He was about to pass out when he saw the figure of the teenage boy go up the driveway. The boy was spreading gasoline over the shed, the garage, and even on the pile of chains still at the upper end of the driveway as Fredo came around the house. When the boy saw Filthy Fredo, he panicked and quickly looked at the book of matches which at once ignited the boy's hands and one of his trouser legs. Fredo pushed the boy down to the ground and away from the gasoline. He was less concerned with the boy than with keeping the gasoline from igniting. Although when he contemplated the shed and garage, They were crammed, solid containers of spare parts with very little to burn, a bit of residue of grease or oil. The structures themselves were of wood, as one would expect from a man who loved iron and would have nothing but contempt for aluminum siding or prefab metal panels. He remembered now that he had read in one of his books on iron the following passage. One would expect to find few samples of ancient ironworks, and many of brass and bronze. However, the reverse is true. For nothing is as destructive as man, and while time has a ferocious effect on badly cured and maintained forged or cast iron, man has an even more pernicious effect on brass and bronze, because they are more precious and often employed by men of war. Ornate baptistry doors and colossal cannons are subject to remelting and reworking. Works of art become works of war. In turn, plain shields are converted to decorative serving platters. Iron, properly forged and cured, watches implacably, resisting wave after wave of heat and cold, army after army. And I'm going to suspend the story there. And you have to buy the book if you want to know. Good night.
Hi, I'm going to introduce Martín Espada. So, I'm just going to read a little bit about his work. According to Judges Caroline Ford, Charles Simic, and Daniel Harper from the Redstone Fellowship, Espada brings to American poetry an imagination and a sense of history which it has not previously known. The greatness of Espada's art, like all great art, is that it gives dignity to the insulted and injured of the earth. End of the quote. Martín Espada was born in Brooklyn, New York, 1957. Besides his new book poetry called City of Coffins and Dead Radiators, he has written three previous books called The Immigrant Icebox Bolero in 1982, Trumpets from the Islands of Their Eviction in 1987, and Rebellion is the Circle of Lover Hands in 1990. His work has also been published in the Kenyon Review, Plowshares, and After Atlan, Latino Poets of the 90s. Furthermore, his wonderful work has won him two fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts and the 10th Redstone Fellowship. He's currently teaching in the English department of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Today he will be reading poems from his new book, City of Coffin and Dead Radiators. City of Coffin and Dead Radiators. The poems that this book contains are poems about his life experience and not other people's experience that, according to Espada, at the beginning of the quote, are based on lives of those customarily consigned to silence who would make their own best advocates given the chance. End of the quote. Without any further comment, I introduce to you Martín Espada.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, it is really is a pleasure for me to read with Jack Agüeros. I know how that story ends. It's a great ending. You really don't want to miss it. So everybody should buy the book. I've known Jack for probably more than 25 years. And I remember being about 10 years old. I had to have my tonsils out. And that was in the days when tonsils were removed more or less automatically. You know, it's just one part of the body they always cut out sooner or later. And everybody lied to me about it. Everybody said, oh, you get ice cream. You get applesauce. You know. Jack was the only one who told the truth. Man, it's gonna hurt. And for those of you of the younger generation who have not had your tonsils taken out, it is like somebody reaching down your throat and ripping the whole throat out. He's right. So I am actually grateful for that. Not for what he said, not for anyway. I'm going to read mostly from my new book tonight, and I want to begin with an island poem. Since it is a new book, I don't know where the hell the poems are, so got lucky. Start with an island poem. The basic fact in terms of the island, of course, is that it is a colony of the United States. It's about the one thing everybody can agree on across the political spectrum over there. And this poem, on one level, is simply about a friend of mine. So it's very personal. On another level, it's about that colonialism. It's about the history of repression and surveillance of independentistas, pro-independence activists on the island and elsewhere. It's about then why the island is not independent yet, but also about why it will be someday. That spirit. The poem is called "The Lover of a Subversive is Also a Subversive." The lover of a subversive is also a subversive. The painter's compañero was a conspirator, revolutionary convicted to haunt the catacombs of federal prison for the next half-century. When she painted her canvas on the beach, the FBI man squatted behind her on the sand, muddying his dark gray suit and kissing his walkie-talkie, a pallbearer who missed the funeral train. The painter who paints a subversive is also a subversive. In her portrait of him, she imagines his long black twist of hair. In her portraits of herself, she wears a mask or has no mouth. She must sell the canvases, for the FBI man ministers solemnly to the principal at the school where she once taught. The woman who grieves for a subversive is also a subversive. The FBI man is a pale-skinned apparition staring in the subway. She could reach for him and only touch a pillar of ash where the dark gray suit had been. If she hungers to touch her lover, she must brush her fingers on moist canvas. The lover of a subversive is also a subversive. When the beach chilled cold and the bright stumble of tourists deserted, she and the FBI man were left alone with their spying glances as he waited calmly for the sobbing to begin, and she refused to sob. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, and I first visited Puerto Rico when I was about 10 years old. And like any kid, I experienced that new sensation primarily through five senses. Being a fat kid, I experienced it primarily through my mouth. But there I was, like Pac-Man, going across the island, eating, drinking. And I discovered something there, quite inadvertently. I discovered what you might call the taste of colonialism, because you can taste it. It's in the water, it's in the food. And that's what this poem is about. So you might call this my cultural imperialism on vacation poem. It's called Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. On his first visit to Puerto Rico, island of family folklore, the fat boy wandered from table to table with his mouth open. At every table, some great aunt would steer him with cool, spotted hands to a glass of Coca-Cola. One even sang to him in all the English he could remember a Coca-Cola jingle from the 40s. He drank obediently, though he was bored with this potion, familiar from soda fountains in Brooklyn. Then, at a roadside stand off the beach, the fat boy opened his mouth to coco frio, a coconut chilled, then scalped by a machete so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. The boy tilted the green shell overhead and drooled coconut milk down his chin. Suddenly, Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola or Brooklyn, and neither was he. For years afterward, the boy marveled at an island where the people drank Coca-Cola and sang jingles from World War II in a language they did not speak, while so many coconuts in the trees sagged heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. It is okay to applaud, by the way. People don't know what to do. Is this chamber music? Sorry. Okay. This poem involves some things that happened a few years later. I actually wandered here and there. I ended up in law school. And I went to Northeastern in Boston. And while there, I began to realize that there were some contradictions between the life I was leading now and the life I used to lead. Contradictions that some of my students, my fellow students, were not aware of. They were not aware of the price that is paid for the symbols of daily oppression we find all around us. And I began to reflect on a job I'd held in high school, which had a connection to this law school experience, a very strange connection. This is a poem which actually, I had a very interesting conversation with my compañero Roberto Marquez before the reading, so I want to actually dedicate this poem to Roberto and particularly his mother. It's called Who Burns for the Perfection of Paper? At 16, I worked after high school hours at a printing plant that manufactured legal pads. Yellow paper stacked 7 feet high and leaning as I slipped cardboard between the pages, then brushed red glue up and down the stack. No gloves. Fingertips required for the perfection of paper, smoothing the exact rectangle. Sluggish by 9 p.m., the hands would slide along suddenly sharp paper and gather slits thinner than the crevices of the skin, hidden. Then the glue would sting, hands oozing till both palms burned at the punch block. 10 years later, in law school, I knew that every legal pad was glued with the sting of hidden cuts, that every open law book was a pair of hands, upturned and burning. Eventually graduated from law school and spent most of my career as a lawyer working for an organization called Su Clínica Legal. Su Clínica Legal is a legal services program for low-income tenants, mostly Latino, in Chelsea. Now, for those of you who don't know Chelsea, Chelsea is a tough little town right across the Tobin Bridge from Boston. It is year after year the poorest municipality in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That is an oxymoron, Commonwealth. And now, as a gateway city of immigrants, it is about 45-50% Latino. Puerto Rican, Dominican, Guatemalan, Nicaraguan, Salvadoran. One night I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about all those people I had seen pass through my office and pass through that courthouse. And the following poem emerged. The poem is the title poem of the book, City of Coughing and Dead Radiators, Chelsea, Massachusetts. I cannot evict them from my insomniac nights, tenants in the city of coughing and dead radiators. They bang the radiators like cold, hollow marimbas. They cry out to unseen creatures skittering across their feet in darkness. They fold hands over plates to protect food from ceilings black with roaches. And they answer the call of the list. All evictions in court, brays the clerk. Quiet and dutiful as spectral troops returning, they file into the courtroom, crowding the gallery. The patient one from El Salvador, shoemaker's union refugee, slapping his neck to show where that vampire of an army bullet pierced his uncle's windpipe. The red-haired woman with no electricity but the drug's heat, swimming in the pools of her blue bruises, white-skinned as the candle she lives by, and will move this afternoon for $100. The prostitute swollen with pregnancy and sobbing as the landlady sneers miscarriage before a judge poking his broken hearing aid. The girl surrounded by a pleading carousel of children in Spanish bewilderment, sleepless and rapt vigilant, who wins reluctant extermination but loses the youngest, lead paint retarded. The man, alcohol puffed, graph of scars stretching across his belly, locked out, shirt stolen, arrested at the hearing for the rampage of his detox hallucinations. The Guatemalan boy who listens through the wall by his father's landlord-defiant staccato, jolted awake by flashes of the landlord floating over the bed, parade balloon waving a kitchen knife. For all those sprawled downstairs with the work boots crusted map printed on the back, the creases of the judge's face collapse into a fist. As we shut files and click briefcases to leave, a loud-faced man trumpets from the gallery, "Death to legal aid!" This is a happy little poem. I am available for children's parties. Try to see a poem or I can take that. Actually, the law is my favorite source of amusement. Allow me to document that. Things actually got so bad in Chelsea that the courthouse building itself was condemned. But not before I got some good poetry out of it, literally off the bathroom wall. This is a short poem called Courthouse Graffiti for Two Voices. Jimmy C., greatest car thief alive, Chelsea, 88. Then what are you doing here? Look back here, there's a coat of arms back here. It's like there's a couple of badges.
It's the city of New York.
Okay. Obviously, we're in New York City. It makes perfect sense. I admire very much the tenacity of the people in our community. I'm thinking now both about the clients that I mentioned and friends, family that I know. This is a poem for somebody who's not here tonight, but she lives and works in the area, and it's based on a story she told me. The story has to do with a common situation for people in our communities, with another dilemma of language, what you might call a dilemma of bilingualism. I mean, one dilemma of bilingualism is that if you go to school and you learn two languages in college, you're considered a genius. But if you're born and raised with two languages, you're considered an idiot. Another dilemma is a dilemma that's actually faced by children in our community who are compelled to translate for their parents. And most of us here know that situation. So this is a poem about that, and it's called Borofels, for Sonia Nieto. In Brooklyn, the mice were crazy with courage. Bony gray pickpocket snatching crumbs from plates at the table. The roaches panicked in spirals on the floor, or weaved down walls for the sanctuary of cracked paint. No heat, so the oven door drooped open like an immigrant's surprise. Sonia's mother was mute in English, mouth chapped and coughing without words to yell for heat. But the neighbors spoke of borofels, tell borofels, and mice shrivel in traps, roaches kick in poison heaps, steam pipes bang so loud that windows open in winter. Sonia and her mother sailed on a subway train rocking like a ship desperate for light and rose in an untranslated territory of Brooklyn. So Sonia translated. Where is borofels? No one knew. The girl, pinballed by strangers in a hurry, hooded against frost as mouths puffed quick clouds of denial. Sonia saw the uniform, then blue-coated trooper of the U.S. mail, and pleaded for borofels. His face, drowsing in bewilderment, awoke with the gust of what he suddenly understood, and he pointed down the street. You want the Board of Health. They could yell now, like banned poets back from exile. I want to do one. Actually, I wasn't planning on doing this one. It's from my last book. But I want to do it because there's a special friend here, Camilo Perez Bustillo, who co-translated this last book, Rebellion, bilingual. And it's also about an experience we had together working as lawyers for an operation called META, Multicultural Education Training and Advocacy, which is a bilingual education law firm. And we got a call one day, speaking of the dilemmas of bilingualism, we got a call one day from Lynn, Massachusetts. Please come up to Lynn. Over at the high school, they have banned Spanish at lunchtime. Reasons of digestion, I assume. This is more common than you might imagine, the Spanish language being perceived as a threat and banned outright certain times and places in the public schools. And so we went up there and we dealt with the problem. It is rumored that the principal still wakes up in the middle of the night screaming about the Spanish lawyers, as we came to be known. And so I wrote this poem as what you might call an olive branch, with thorns on it. I'll do the poem. It's a short poem, first in Spanish and then in English. The poem is called The New Bathroom Policy at English High School, or Nueva Norma para el Baño en la English High School. Los muchachos cacarean español en el baño, mientras el principal de la escuela los oye desde el inodoro. La única palabra que reconoce es su propio nombre. Y esto le da estreñimiento. Por tanto decide prohibir el español en los baños. Ahora puede rejalarse. The boys chatter Spanish in the bathroom while the principal listens from his stall. The only word he recognizes is his own name. And this constipates him. So he decides to ban Spanish in the bathrooms. Now he can relax. Have you know that poem is on National Public Radio? I'm not sure that's how I want to be remembered. I see it now, 1,000 years from now, post-nuclear rubble. The only thing they're going to find me is in that damn tape. I conclude I was the great scatological poet of the late 20th century. all of these poems, at least the last few poems, particularly poems having to do with the law and courts, have to do more generally with the malaise of bureaucracy, the paralysis of bureaucracy. And I had a professor, Herbert Hill, University of Wisconsin, used to say that there's only two classes of people in this society, clients and constituents. And I've been both. I've been, you know, either you have your own social worker or you haven't, you know. And I have. So this is a poem which is about the fact that that whole bureaucracy experience has seeped literally into my dreams. This was a dream I actually had right after the birth of our son, Clemente, at the end of December 1991, and it's called DSS Dream. I dreamed the Department of Social Services came to the door and said, "We understand you have a baby, a goat, and a pig living here in a two-room apartment." This is illegal. We have to take the baby away. Unless you eat the goat. The pig's okay, I asked? The pig's okay. Okay, I'm going to do 3 more poems. And to do that, I'd like to invite now to join me up here a friend and fine bass player. You may have noticed, by the world's biggest violin in the corner over there. I'd like to invite the man who plays that instrument up here with me now. His name is Michael Marcus. He's going to play this bass while I am reading. Not too loudly. Okay. This next poem follows from the last one because it's also about the birth of our son, Clemente, Camilo, Gilbert, Espada, etc., etc. Born December 28, 1991. And this poem is a tribute to him. It's also a tribute to his mother, Catherine, and to the courage they both showed. And it's ultimately about how each new birth for us gives us an opportunity to break cycles. In this case, a cycle of violence that is part of our family histories. The poem is called White Birch for Catherine, December 28, 1991. Two decades ago, rye whiskey scalded your father's throat, stinking from the mouth as he stamped his shoe in the groove between your hips, dizzy flailing cartwheel down the stairs. The tail of your spine split, became a scraping hook. For 20 years a fire raced across the boughs of your bones, his drunken mouth a movie, flashing with every stab gesture. Now the white room of birth is throbbing. The numbers palpitating red on the screen of machinery tentacled to your arm. The oxygen mask wedged in a wheeze on your face. The numbing medication injected through the spine. The boy was snagged on that spiraling bone. Medical fingers prodded your raw pink center while you stared at a horizon of water no one else could see. Creatures leaping silver with tails that slash the air like your agonized tongue. You were born in the river valley. Hard green checkerboard of farms, a town of white birches, and a churchyard from the workhorse time. Weathered headstones naming women drained of blood with infants coiled inside the caging hips. Hymns swaying as if lanterns over the mounded earth. Then the white birch of your bones, resilient and yielding, yielded again, Roots snapped as the boy spilled out of you into hands burst open by beckoning and voices pouring praise like water. Two beings tangled in exhaustion, blood painted, but full of breath. After a generation of burning, the hook unfurled in your body, the crack in the bone dissolved. One day you stood, expected again the branch of nerves fanning across your back to flame, and felt only the grace of birches. Two more. What these last two poems have in common is that they're both about the right to speak, and those who defend the right to speak, who sacrifice everything for the right to speak, sometimes even their lives. And without those sacrifices, none of us would have anything worth having. So I celebrate that spirit of resistance. And these two poems have that in common. This first poem was written after I visited San Antonio, Texas, a few years ago. I know some people here from San Antonio. Right. I was there, I had a chance to visit the Alamo. And I made a connection between that and the last time an Espada, my family anyway, visited San Antonio, which was in 1949, when my father was stationed there at Lackland Air Force Base. And I recall, too, an incident that happened with him when he was refused service in the segregated lunch counter. And I began to realize that that was the other Alamo. That's what this poem is called. The Other Alamo, San Antonio, Texas, 1990. In the Crockett Hotel dining room, a chalk-faced man in medal uniform growls a prayer at the head of the veterans table. Throughout the map of this saint-hungry city, hands strain for the touch of shrines, genuflection before cannon and memorial plaque, grasping the talisman of Bowie knife replica at the souvenir shop, visitors in white biblical quote t-shirts. The stones in the walls are smaller than the fists of Texas martyrs. Their cavernous mouths could drink the canal to mud. The Daughters of the Republic print brochures dancing with Mexican demons. Santa Ana's legs still hopping a conjunto accordion. The lawyers who conquered farmland by scratching on parchment in an oil lamp gaze. The cotton growers who kept the time of Mexican peasant lives dangling from their watch chains. The vigilantes hooded like blind angels, hunting with torches for men the color of night, gathering in church, the capital, or the porch for a century, all said this: Alamo. Three boys in Air Force dress khaki ignored the whites only sign at the diner by the bus station. A soldier from Baltimore who heard nigger sung here more often than his name, but would not glance away. Another blond and solemn as his Tennessee of whitewashed spires. Another from distant Puerto Rico, cap tipped at an angle in a country where brown skin could be boiled for the leather of a vigilante's wallet. The waitress squinted a glare and refused their contamination. The manager lost his crew-cut politeness and blustered about local customs. The police, with surrounding faces, jeered about tacos and senoritas on the Mexican side of town. We're not leaving, they said. and hunched at their stools till the manager ordered the cook, sweat-burnished black man unable to hide his grin, to slide cheeseburgers on plates across the counter. "We're not hungry," they said, and left a week's pay for the cook. One was my father. His word for fury is Texas. Afternoon, the heat clouds the air like bothered gnats. The lunch counter was wrecked for the dump years ago. In the newspapers, a report of vandals scarring the wooden doors of the Alamo in black streaks of fire. I wish I could take you with me everywhere. Me too. Okay, this is the last poem. And this takes us to El Salvador. I guess, again, I want to thank everybody for putting this together. I want to thank Odyssey Bookshop and La Unidad, and thank everybody for being here. And after this last poem, there'll be pandemonium in the lobby, and you're welcome to join us. We'll be out there signing books and engaging in the usual bochinches. In January of 1991, I was quite honored to have some poems published in Diario Latino. Diario Latino is an opposition newspaper in El Salvador. Opposition to what? Of course, opposition to the military, the death squads, the government there responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in that country, and funded, of course, by the United States, sometimes to the tune of more than $1 million a day. And so these people have a great deal of courage, and I was very glad to see the poems come out in that newspaper. In February of 1991, a month later, Diario Latino was burned to the ground.
They didn't like your poems.
I've heard of getting panned, but man. Everybody knew who did it, of course. Now, the people at Diario Latino didn't give up. They patched that newspaper together, a little bit at a time. Page here, page there, until finally, a year later, the newspaper was back to full strength. And on the first anniversary of the fire, February of '92, this poem was published in Diario Latino. It's a tribute to them. It's written in response to the fire, but of course, it's also a response to any situation, anywhere, where people are fighting to speak and where the voices somehow manage to rise above the flames. Many of the details in the poem come from a letter I got from down there. And the poem is called When Songs Become Water, for Diario Latino, El Salvador, 1991. Where dubbed commercials sell the tobacco and alcohol of a far winter metropolis. Where the lungs of night cough artillery shots into the ears of sleep. Where strikers with howls stiff on their faces and warnings pinned to their shirts are harvested from garbage heaps. Where olive uniforms keep watch over the plaza from a nest of rifle eyes and sandbags. Where the government party campaigns chanting through loudspeakers that this country will be the common grave of the Reds. There, the newsprint of mutiny is as medicine on the fingertips, and the beat of the press printing mutiny is like the pounding of tortillas in the hands. When the beat of the press is like the pounding of tortillas, and the newsprint is medicine on the fingertips, come the men with faces wiped away by the hood, who smother the mouth of witness night, shaking the gasoline can across the floor, then scattering in a dark orange eruption of windows, leaving the paper to wrinkle gray in the heat. Where the faces wiped away by the hood are known by the breath of gasoline on their clothes, and paper wrinkles gray as the skin of incarcerated talkers, Another army helicopter plunges from the sky with blades burning like the wings of a gargoyle. The tortilla and medicine words are smuggled in shawls. The newspapers are hoarded like bundles of letters from the missing. The poems become songs, and the songs become water streaming through the arteries of the earth, where others at the well will cool the sweat in their hair and begin to think.
La Unidad is having Puerto Rican Week of November, so and it's from November 15th, no 10th. Alright, yeah, November 15th through the 19th. And I'm just going to give you the event that we're having. On November 15th, Efraín Barrada is going to talk about the art history of Puerto Rican art. He thinks that it's very interesting to talk about that because Puerto Rico does not have an art history. We don't have it, even though we have painters. And that's at 4 o'clock on the Campbell Auditorium. On Tuesday, there's going to be either a movie called La Gran Fiesta, or we're going to have a cuadrero. I don't know how to say that in English, but it's a small concert from a guy on Amherst called Jose Gonzalez. And on Wednesdays, we're going to have two actors. One is called Jack Agüeros, and the other one is Luis Delgado. And on Thursday, Professor Marquez is going to talk about history of Puerto Ricans in the United States and the question of colonialism. And Friday is we're going to have a party, and it's in here. And on Saturday, we're going to have a historian from Puerto Rico called Fernando Pico. And that's about it. And Joan from the Odyssey Bookstore also has some announcements.
And it's going to take a minute. First of all, I'd like to thank La Unidad, especially Lisa Diaz and Ruby Marentes for working so hard on this event, and Bob and Mary Marquez. I just wanted to encourage people to sign up on our mailing list so that you can hear about events that are going on. We have that out in the hallway. This fall is our 30th anniversary, and we really have some wonderful people coming, including Susanna Kaysen, who right now is on the New York Times bestseller list with Girl Interrupted. Audrina Rich is going to be here. Rakim Mukherjee is going to be here. Gloria Wade Gales, Albert French, and John Edgar Wideman, Naomi Wolf, and our finale is going to be Sweet Honey in the Rock, who have a book coming out, and they'll be talking about their music and their lives. So there's a whole list here that you can pick up on the table, and I encourage you to sign up. Thank you all for coming, too.